in the previous section, we set up the third alert controller. So this is the alert controller triggered when the user presses on button 3, and this is kind of simulating our login scenario. So once we set it up, we had some messages printed appropriately, so when the user brings it up, it sets up this alert controller properly, and it says user's trying to log in. If the user cancels it, it just says login has been cancelled. Okay, so we added a couple of actions. One was that cancel action, just dismisses the alert controller. One is the actual login action. We haven't implemented it yet because that's what we're going to do in this section here. And then we added a couple of text fields also, one for the username and one for the password. So now, like I said, we're going to finish implementing this login functionality. So we'll be working mostly in this login action handler rather than in the text field configuration handlers. Now, these are called configuration handlers again because these are used mostly to set up the text field's attributes rather than retrieve any functionality or associate any functionality with them. Typically, we'll use our action that's associated with an alert controller to both retrieve the text and make sure that nothing goes wrong. So first we'll make sure that there are text fields attached, make sure there is text in there, and then we can use this to check the text we find against some fake mini database of users. So let's do that first. Let's set up that mini database of users, and all I'm going to do is just create a simple array with a username and another array for the password. So we could have something like this, list of users. Okay, this could be a string array. Okay, and then we could have something like a list of passwords that are associated with those users, again, another string array. Now, this is not really a very good way of setting up this database. Usually, at the very least, you'd want a separate class for the user, and the user would have a username and password they'd have username and password fields, but it's a little bit more work than we need to do for this section. My goal here is mostly to show you how to set up the alert controller, so let's just do things this way. So we're just going to have some username and a password. It's just my name, and let's just put password here. And we're basically just going to pretend that this is a list of users and each index corresponds with the correct username and password. Okay, so we're just going to get these guys and we're going to test them against the values we find in the text fields to see if we can successfully log in or not. So we'll scroll down here and let's get implementing in our login action. So hopefully you guys at least took a shot at trying to solve the issue. Remember I said that we can pull up this variable called alert controller dot text fields, okay, and it's this optional array of text fields. It's optional because we might not have added any, so that might be nil, and it's an array of text fields because we can add at least one or more. Okay. So the first step will be to retrieve any text fields found within the alert controller. Then we're going to go through each one and match against first the username and then the password. Okay. Now, like I said, that text field array is optional, so we're going to use a guardlet statement to see if we have any text fields in this alert controller. And although this step is strictly not necessary because we know we've added a couple of text fields, so these have to exist, it's a good idea to check anyway. And also because I don't really like using optionals, it's better to unwrap them with guardlets and if-let statements and then use non-optional type variables. Keep in mind that the order in which we add the text fields is the order in which they appear in the array. So we added the first text field that contains a username. This one is going to be at position 0, and the password text field will be at position 1. As well, if we're kind of unsure about the positioning, we can attach what's called an accessibility identifier to these text fields. So we could just say something like text field dot accessibility identifier, okay, equals some string. We could have it say something like text field 1, and then we could use this to identify the correct text field. Again, this step is not necessary as we know the order in which we added these text fields, and so we know this should be position 0 and position 1. Okay, so the accessibility identifier just adds an extra level of security, not necessary in this case, so we'll choose not to add it in. Okay, so let's use a guardlet statement to determine whether or not our alert controller has text fields to begin with. We'll simply say guardlet, let's call this one text fields, okay? And this is going to be equal to our alert controller dot text fields, okay? And if there are no text fields associated with this, let's put an else, and then we'll print something out. So we'll just say print something, and then we're just going to return. So by the way, you can put multiple things on a single line if they're separated with this semicolon. So in this case, we're just going to print no text fields on alert controller. Okay, and that's fine, and then we'll just return. Otherwise, let's assume that text fields is non-optional, that we do have some, and we can just access the text fields at position 0 and 1. Okay, this is probably going to tell me that we need self, and it is indeed, so let's just put self.alertController. Okay, so now we want to retrieve the first text field and the second text field. Let's say our username text field, okay, equals, and actually I don't want the N capitalized, let's just do that. Well, this is simply going to be equal to text fields at position 0. We could even do text fields first, not necessary. And then we could say something like password text field equal text fields at position 1. If we wanted to save some lines, we actually wouldn't necessarily have to store these text fields in their own variables, and I think we might as well do that. We might as well try and save as many lines of code as we can. So we're actually just going to pull the text right away. So text, and then .text, and then let's change these variable names. So rather than a username text field, this can be username text, okay, and then password text. And remember that these actually return optional type strings. So we want to make sure that not only are these texts not nil, but we also need to make sure that they are not empty strings either. Okay, let's just use some guard-let statements for these as well. So we're going to say guard-let username text field equal our text fields.text, else we're simply going to say no text in our text field. Okay, so we can do the same thing we did up here. We'll use a print statement. Okay, but we'll need to change this. Instead of no text fields on alert controller, we can put something like no username entered. Alright, and we'll do the same for the password text, so guard-let again. We'll just copy this else, paste it in, and in this case it's going to say no password entered. Okay, so now we're retrieving the text from our username, the text from our password. These are stored in username and password text respectively. The next step will be to check to see if these are equal to our current list of users. So, or at least the values found in those lists. Okay, so we're going to say something like if our username text, and actually we'll probably have to do self.username text, and we want to check to see if this equals our list, let's say self.list of users, okay, at position 0, and we'll have to have an additional case, and in fact we actually don't need the self.username text, we can actually get that out. We're just going to say username text, actually this one is password text, okay, password text equals our self.list of passwords at position 0. Okay, in this case we're good to go and we can actually start to log in. Okay, so usually we would actually initialize some kind of, or initiate is actually the word I was looking for, some kind of login sequence, which will be to kind of dismiss the alert controller. It could maybe take us to a new page. It would load our own settings, our own like personal account settings or something. In this case, we're not going to do very much. We're just going to, we can change some label text. Okay, and then we can just dismiss the alert controller. Okay, so this is assuming the credentials are correct. We can print something like login successful. All right, and then let's change some label text. So we have a couple of labels, label 1 and label 2. Let's just have these display our username and password. Let's see where we're working. We could say label self.label1.text equals, we could say welcome, and then our username. So self, actually this should be our self.list of users at position 0. Okay, and then we can set label 2 to be our password if we want or something, not strictly necessary. Label 2.text equals the current password. Okay, and this is just going to be whatever our self.list of passwords at position 0 is. Okay, and if either of these credentials are wrong, we could just print something out. We could say something like print incorrect username or password. Now, ideally what we'd want in this kind of login scenario, if this is incorrect, is we want to notify the user as to what's going on. So we'd have to say that the login was unsuccessful or something so that the user knows that the password and username combo is incorrect. So what we could do is change one of these label texts to display this message, incorrect username or password, and then simply dismiss the alert controller or something. So maybe we'd actually want to save label 2 for that, but it doesn't really matter too much. We can just say like something like self.label1.text is equal to incorrect username or password. Okay, and if you want to be specific, then you could say, okay, if the username doesn't match, print incorrect username. If the password doesn't match, print incorrect password or whatever. Generally safer to display a more generic message. But again, slightly more annoying for the user. Okay, and then we're just going to say self.alertController.dismiss. Okay, we're going to say true, and then the completion, we're just not going to have anything happen. We can set that to be nil. Okay, so we have a pretty good login scenario here. We've basically just retrieved our text fields that are attached to the alert controller. We're retrieving the username and password texts. We're checking to see if they are equal to our correct username and password. If they are, we'll simply print login successful, change some of the label text to display that, and we should also just return here. This will just should cause our alert controller to dismiss automatically. But if it doesn't, we can simply call self.alertController.dismiss. Otherwise, we're just dismissing the alert controller and printing incorrect username and password on that label. So let's go ahead and test this out and see if this is working correctly. Okay, if it isn't, then we can tweak whatever bugs or errors we might have. If not, then we have a successful login scenario. So let's pull up button 3. Okay, let's try and enter some garbage username and password. Okay, not working. Says incorrect username and password. That the alert controller is being dismissed. That is good. Let's enter something correct. Then we'll have password, and then we can log in. It says welcome Nimish. Current password is password. Maybe we'll want to display that. Maybe we'll not. But looks like the login is successful. Even says down here login successful. Okay, so there you have it. We've now successfully implemented our login scenario. So that is the basics of our UI alert controllers. We now know how to set them up to display simple messages. We can also dismiss them after a certain amount of time based on this delay. And using stuff like the dispatch queue and the dispatch time, we can dismiss them using just a simple cancel action. That's another thing we know how to do. We can add several actions to a simple alert controller. And these we can just kind of think of as being buttons that will basically execute some code that we put in the handler itself. Okay. After that, we looked at how to add text fields to our alert controllers. We did this by simulating this login scenario. It's actually quite easy to add them. You just add text field, add some configuration handler to set the text field up. And then if you want to pull text from them, you can call on the alert controller.text fields. Okay. And we can kind of mimic this scenario that we have going on with this login functionality. Okay, press button 4 just pulls up our action sheet, which has a lot more limited functionality than the regular alert type alert controller, but nevertheless has its uses. Okay, so in the last section, we're just going to take a look at how to customize the appearance of these alert controllers a bit. We can't do quite as much as we could with a regular view, but there will be some ways in which we can make it look a little better. We customize our text fields a bit and stuff, so that's what we'll be exploring in this section coming right up.